Chapter 1. The Ceremony of Appearances. In the imposing coastal region of Puerto Celeste, where the sea lapped at the feet of colonial mansions and surnames carried more weight than words, one of the most anticipated weddings of the year took place. The union between Natalia Fuentes, heiress to one of the city's most traditional families, and Gustavo Salmeron, a promising port businessman. It was the kind of union sealed long before love existed, because in that world, love came after the contract, or never. The guests smiled, the cameras captured the perfect angles, and the newspapers were already preparing glowing headlines. But behind the facade of happiness, hidden among the lace bows and orchid bouquets, a shadow grew. The gaze of Juliana Fuentes, the bride's younger sister, who watched everything silently, suffocated between her role as bridesmaid and the weight of an unspeakable secret. Juliana was always second in everything, second daughter, second best, second best. She grew up in the shadow of her perfect sister, Natalia, the diplomatic, the sober, her parents' favorite. But Juliana carried the kind of beauty that burned, intense, impatient, full of vivid emotions. And that was exactly what captivated Gustavo's gaze from their first family dinner. What began as an exchange of glances turned into confessions in hallways, touches hidden under linen tablecloths, and finally, secret meetings on afternoons when the city slept. Juliana knew she was crossing a sacred line. Gustavo did too. But neither of them backed down. When Natalia finally entered the church, veiled and proud, Juliana had a difficult-to-decipher expression on her face. Many thought it was envy, others jealousy, but no one, not even she, could tell if it was guilt or the beginning of liberation. The marriage was consummated, but peace would never come. Because what was sealed on that altar was poisoned by a betrayal that everyone thought they knew. But the true betrayal was still buried, waiting for the right moment to emerge. If this story has you hooked so far, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. What comes next will turn everything upside down. Chapter 2. The Silent Game of Accomplices. After the ceremony, the waters of Puerto Celeste seemed calmer than usual, but it was a deceptive calm, the kind that precedes the most devastating storms. Inside the Fuentes mansion, now converted into the wedding reception venue, fake smiles danced to the string quartet and glasses clinked with expensive champagne, unaware that they were toasting the beginning of a war. Juliana, dressed in dark blue, posed for photos next to her newlywed sister, but her gaze constantly strayed toward Gustavo, and he, even between greetings and speeches, couldn't hide his discomfort. It was as if Juliana's presence unnerved him more than any threat. Natalia, for her part, looked radiant, and perhaps she was. After all, she had everything a high society woman should have: a wealthy husband, a ring on her finger, established social status, and the approval of her parents. But what she didn't know, and what she would never have suspected, is that at that very moment, beneath the imported carpets in the main room, her marriage was already a sham buried alive. In the days that followed, Gustavo did his best to keep up appearances, but every gesture he made in public with Natalia seemed forced, rehearsed, almost robotic. Behind the scenes, however, he sent Juliana cryptic messages, asking for meetings, asking for time, pleading for courage. Juliana accepted them, maybe for love, maybe out of pride. But with each new clandestine encounter, she plunged deeper into a relationship that dragged her to two extremes: the pleasure of conquest and the guilt of betrayal. What she didn't know yet, however, was that Gustavo played on more than one board. Behind the forbidden romance lay documents, contracts, transfers, and a series of business decisions being made in the shadows, involving the Fuentes family without Natalia's knowledge. Juliana was an accomplice at heart, but she could be being used as a distraction. And while she was drowning in her feelings, someone very close to her was already beginning to suspect that the real betrayal was not in the bedroom, but in the family safe. Chapter 3. The Shadows in the Family Vault. In the Fuentes mansion, the hallways carried echoes of an ancient history made of family glories and whispered secrets. None of them, however, were as heavy as what now formed within the elegant walls of that imposing house. And while the city's eyes were fixed on Gustavo and Natalia's rehearsed gestures as perfect newlyweds, a new character emerged from the edges of the story. Tadeo Fuentes, their older brother. Tadeo was a lawyer, cold, meticulous, and never involved himself in the family's emotional affairs. He always preferred the behind-the-scenes, where he could move the needle with precision. But in recent days, something had caught his attention: abnormal bank transactions, credit requests in the name of the family winery, and authorizations signed with Natalia's seal. Signatures she certainly never would have signed in good faith. Tadeo wasn't close to Juliana, nor did he trust Gustavo. From the beginning, he'd observed his brother-in-law's behavior with suspicion, as if sniffing something rotten beneath the veneer. But now, with the statements in hand, his suspicions became concrete. There was hidden financial activity. That same week, he discreetly hired an expert to examine the signatures on documents registered months before the wedding. The results came quickly. The signatures were forgeries. And among the documents, the name of an unknown company emerged, headquartered in another country, directly linked to Gustavo, and with a bank account in Juliana Fuentes' name. The shock was immediate. Juliana, involved in a forbidden relationship, now also appeared to be linked to a financial scheme that involved embezzlement of the family's assets. But something still didn't make sense to Tadeo. Why would Gustavo use his lover's name? Was it to protect her, or to sacrifice her if something went wrong? Meanwhile, Juliana remained in love and blind. In Gustavo's arms, she believed she was seen, chosen, loved. But in reality, it was slowly becoming a chess piece that would be discarded once it outlived its usefulness. And Natalia. Still in the dark, she began to notice a void in her husband's gaze. It wasn't an absence of love, it was an absence of truth. And this absence, like a perfume spreading through the house, began to fill her lungs with the weight of foreboding. She didn't know it yet. But the betrayal she had suffered wasn't just from sister to sister. It was a betrayal with many faces, and the cruelest one had yet to be revealed. Chapter 4. The Omen in the Mirror. By the third month of marriage, Natalia Fuentes no longer smiled with the same enthusiasm at social events. Her dress was still impeccable, her hairdo carefully styled, her words elegantly chosen. But there was an emptiness beginning to inhabit her eyes. It was the kind of look only someone who has been deceived without knowing it can carry. She had no proof, no confessions, only feelings that grew like dampness between the ancient walls of the mansion where she lived with Gustavo. And it was on a seemingly ordinary morning, while rummaging through one of her closets for a necklace inherited from her grandmother, that she found a small, forgotten silver box. Inside were 3 yellowed letters, not addressed to her but to Juliana. The handwriting was Gustavo's, the content direct. Passionate declarations, escape plans, suggested travel dates, and most painfully, explicit references to the night of their engagement, when Juliana was with him. The same day Natalia announced her union to her parents. Natalia didn't scream. She didn't cry. He sat in front of the mirror and stayed there. For hours, he looked at his own reflection, as if trying to understand at what point he stopped seeing. But the pain, although immense, did not paralyze her. That same week, she discreetly hired a private investigator. Not to confirm the betrayal, she already knew, but to go beyond the obvious. and what began as a simple request soon turned into a web of unexpected discoveries. Offshore accounts, hidden business ties, front men, and suspicious transactions in Juliana's own name. Natalia now faced a paradox. Her sister, her traitor, was also a potential victim. On the other side of town, Taddeo, with the forged documents in hand, had already made copies and stored them out of Gustavo's reach. He was ready to act, but he was waiting for the right moment, and hoping Natalia would be strong enough to face whatever was coming. Meanwhile, Juliana, still emotionally involved with Gustavo, began to feel the first signs of abandonment. The messages diminished. The meetings became fewer. The man who had once captivated her with promises now became vague, evasive, and mysterious. She didn't know it, but she was about to discover that the betrayal that destroyed her sister was the same one that was now turning against her. If this story has kept you hooked so far, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. The true traitor is increasingly exposed, and the downfall will be inevitable. Chapter 5. The downfall begins in silence. In his office with dark walls and imported furniture, Gustavo Salmeron typed frantically. His eyes darted between screens, numbers ticking up and down, alerts from foreign accounts, pending transfer requests, and a notification that paralyzed him: unauthorized external access. In another tab, Taddeo Fuentes' name flickered discreetly between crossed documents, raising a dangerous doubt. Gustavo slammed his laptop shut. The pressure he'd previously controlled with charm and manipulation now threatened to collapse. His alliance tightened its grip. The castle he'd built on seduction, paperwork, and silence began to tremble. Meanwhile, Juliana walked the streets of Puerto Celeste with a void in her chest. Her meetings with Gustavo had completely ceased. The messages had stopped. The phone, once a bridge between two worlds, was now a wall. She knocked on doors that no longer opened, and all he received was the echo of his own naivety. But something inside her was beginning to move. A subtle distrust, like the wind before the storm. He began to review what Gustavo had left at his house: a folder, a few copies, and inside an envelope he had never opened, he discovered a contract, with his name, with his digital signature, with a company he had never heard of. And there it was. Juliana, according to the records, was the majority shareholder of an offshore company in the Virgin Islands, used, exposed, prepared for sacrifice, like a pawn in a game she never knew she was playing. Across town, Natalia met Taddeo for the first time since their wedding. They both knew that this was no longer a family drama. It was an economic, social, and moral crime. Natalia, with the letters in hand and the private investigators' reports, now saw clearly, and she decided Gustavo would be confronted in public. And with everything. But fate sometimes anticipates itself. The next morning, a federal operation took the city by surprise. Financial agents surrounded the headquarters of the companies Salmeron and Fuentes, seized documents, froze assets, and took computers. The scandal made headlines in newspapers, social media, and international media, and in the eye of the storm, an unexpected name stood out: Juliana Fuentes, investigated for money laundering and currency evasion. The world was crashing down on her, alone, ashamed, abandoned. Juliana cried like never before, but she didn't know that on the other side, her sister, the same one she had hurt, was about to do something that would change the course of history forever. Chapter 6. The outstretched hand in the storm. The scandal had swept through Puerto Celeste like a hurricane. The Fuentes family, once a symbol of tradition and prestige, now graced newspaper covers and dominated the news. But among the faces plastered across the walls, Juliana's emerged as the protagonist, not of the emotional tragedy everyone remembered, but of an international crime. Images of her being summoned to testify circulated widely. Her name was on contracts, tax records, and shell companies that generated millions. The accusation was serious and public, but those who judged from the outside didn't know what she now clearly understood. She had been used from the beginning. While Juliana plunged into despair, Natalia, from the height of the pain that still pulsed in her memory, did the unthinkable. Alongside Taddeo, he gathered documents, proof that Juliana never had control over those accounts. Forged signatures, altered records, the entire structure created by Gustavo, who had now disappeared, leaving a trail across Central America. He disappeared like cowards disappear, leaving behind not just debts and papers, but human wreckage. On the afternoon Juliana was officially summoned, Natalia was waiting for her at the courthouse door. She didn't go with resentment. There was no vengeance in her eyes. He took a briefcase. And the truth. Juliana saw her. She didn't have the strength to react, but her eyes said it all. Natalia didn't say a single word. He handed over the folder and remained there like a sentinel before the ruin. Within the material, the complete technical defense. Reports, evidence, statements, everything ready to free Juliana from the hell she had been pushed into. And in that silent gesture, something new was born. Not a forced reconciliation, nor a complete forgiveness, but a pact of rescue. The trial would still take place. Juliana's name would remain tarnished for some time, but the basis of her downfall had been removed. Natalia didn't do this just for herself. She did it herself, because he finally understood that the true traitor was not the one who loved wrongly, but the one who manipulated everyone around him with purpose and coldness. Meanwhile, justice took its course, and Gustavo, even far away, was already the target of warrants, international alerts, and cross-investigations. The fall was not yet complete, but it was inevitable. Chapter 7. Rebuilding among the rubble. The days following the scandal were long and silent for Juliana Fuentes. The world that had once treated her with admiration or desire now regarded her with disdain. People crossed the street to avoid her. Whispers arose in cafes, markets, and online. She was no longer just the woman who had gotten involved with her sister's husband. Now she was the accomplice, the elegant criminal, the shame of the Fuentes family. But what few knew, or even imagined, was that Juliana was no longer driven by pride or passion. She had spent entire nights lying on the bedroom floor, staring at the ceiling, as if searching for an explanation that never came. And among the pieces of herself, she found something stronger than remorse, the desire to start over, even if no one believed in her anymore. Thanks to the material provided by Natalia and Taddeo's in-depth investigation, the prosecutor's office recognized that Juliana had been used as a front. The most serious charges were dropped. There was still a case, a stigma, but the most deadly weight, that of public condemnation, was beginning to lift. She didn't return to the mansion. He refused any return to the family circle of privilege. She settled into a small house near the port, where she began working with at-risk youth, offering guidance and emotional support. There, where no one had expected her before, she found her first glimpse of peace. Meanwhile, Natalia now occupied an unexpected position. Her public image, previously tied to her perfect marriage, became a symbol of resistance. She took control of the winery, faced the media, restructured contracts, and removed Gustavo's name from all records and records. But her greatest act was personal. She stopped hiding behind titles, alliances, or traditions. She began giving lectures on silent emotional abuse. She became a reference. She didn't seek the spotlight. She just spoke the truth. The name Gustavo Salmeron, on the other hand, became increasingly difficult to trace. Authorities discovered more accounts, more frontmen, and more victims. But he remained on the run, jumping from country to country until he completely disappeared in northern Colombia under a false identity. However, like every lie that slips through the cracks, his would also have an end. And fate, sometimes ironic, prepared an unexpected reunion, because even between continents there were things Gustavo couldn't avoid: the desire for control and the fear of oblivion. It was this desire that led him to make the fatal mistake. A digital contact, an encrypted message sent to an old connection, and it was this message that, for the first time in months, triggered an alert in Tadeo's system. The siege was beginning to close, and for the first time since the beginning of the story, the three key pieces, Juliana, Natalia, and Gustavo, would be about to occupy the same board. Chapter 8. The Pride Trap. Gustavo Salmeron's mistake wasn't running away, nor was it falsifying documents, opening shell companies, or manipulating women to hide his ambition. The fatal flaw was the same one that had driven him from the start: pride. It was out of pride that he wanted to mark his territory even in exile. It was out of pride that he sent from a hotel in Barranquilla an encrypted message to an old contact in the wine industry, a disguised attempt to regain influence, to open new doors under a false name. But Gustavo underestimated something: the persistence of Tadeo Fuentes. When the message's digital signal was tracked by international banking security systems, Tadeo was immediately notified. The IP address was active, and even with layers of encryption, the initial location was identified. Within 72 hours, with the support of an international task force, a siege began to quietly form. Meanwhile, in Puerto Celeste, Juliana continued her simple, silent routine. I had relearned how to walk among people without expecting smiles. I also learned that forgiveness, especially self-forgiveness, is a process. And in this process, one constant presence returned: Natalia. They didn't talk about the past. They didn't need to. The encounters took place in silence, on a walk on the beach, in a voluntary delivery, over coffee left on the table. The pain was not forgotten, but it stopped being a blade and became a scar, one that now united them in an unexpected way, as survivors of the same lie. The night Tadeo received confirmation of Gustavo's exact location, he called both of them, presented the documents, strategy, and plan. Take. Gustavo back to answer for the crimes committed. Natalia listened calmly, but it was Juliana who asked that she herself was present at the time of the arrest. Not for revenge, but because I needed to look into the eyes of the one who destroyed 2 sisters, 2 families, and used love as a tool of power. 3 days later, in a joint operation with Interpol, Gustavo was captured at a luxury beachfront restaurant. She used a different name, a different passport, but the same eyes, the same ones, that once promised Juliana everything and stole everything from Natalia. When he saw the 2 approaching the scene, he didn't try to escape. He didn't beg. He just lowered his head. In that gesture, there was no remorse, only defeat, because the kind of man Gustavo was would never learn from guilt. He would only suffer from the loss of control. At the international police station, while signing the extradition papers, the Fuentes sisters did not exchange a single word. But as they walked out the front door together, with their heads held high and their steps firm, the world finally understood. The story was not about betrayal, it was about resistance. Chapter 9. The Weight of the Name. Fuentes Gustavo Salmeron's arrest made headlines across Latin America. The charismatic businessman, once a symbol of success and sophistication, was now presented to the world as a fraud, a manipulator, and a mastermind of lies. In Puerto Celeste, where everyone knew the surname Fuentes by heart, and where the marriage between Natalia and Gustavo had been celebrated as an alliance of power and prestige, the fall had repercussions like a moral earthquake. At first, many wanted to point fingers. Some blamed Juliana. Others, Natalia. After all, it was easier to hold the women involved accountable than to admit that everyone had been deceived by a man who used charm as poison. But it only took a few days for the tide to turn. The press began to highlight Tadeo Fuentes' role in the investigations, Natalia's courage in facing her ex-husband in court, and Juliana's surprising gesture, who despite everything cooperated with the authorities, handing over evidence and testifying against the man she once believed she loved. It was then that the name Fuentes began to rebuild itself, no longer as a symbol of elitism, but as an example of overcoming and justice. Natalia relaunched the winery with a new vision: transparency, social impact, and female leadership. She created training programs for vulnerable women, donated part of the profits to the region's recovery, and promoted the recovery of families affected by Gustavo's fraudulent schemes. Juliana, in turn, transformed the small house in the harbour into a psychological and legal support centre for women trapped in abusive relationships. She called the space Casa Albor, Dawn, because something new was born there every day, and Tadeo, previously quiet and discreet, became a public defender of family and property causes, making public the strategies that allowed Gustavo's international scheme to be dismantled. His name became synonymous with firmness without arrogance. The sisters, though they still bore scars, now walked side by side in events, interviews, and causes that helped heal not only the city, but themselves. And little by little, what began as a tragedy turned into a lesson. Meanwhile, in the federal prison where he awaited final trial, Gustavo received visits from lawyers paid for by accounts that had already been frozen. His habeas corpus petitions were denied. His public image was irreparable, but even while imprisoned, he still tried to keep the game going through letters, veiled threats, and attempts to manipulate new contacts. However, the world around him had already changed, and there was no more room for men like him. Chapter 10. Where ruins bloom. Time, like the winds of Puerto Celeste, never stops. Months have passed since Gustavo Salmeron's arrest, and the city has learned to breathe again. The headlines gave way to new scandals, justice took its course, and the name Fuentes, which had once weighed like a curse, now flourished as a symbol of a new beginning. At the top of the hill, surrounded by revitalized vineyards, Hacienda Renaca, the name chosen by Natalia to replace the old winery, celebrated its first harvest since its reconstruction. But more than grapes, there were lessons, dignity, and freedom to be gathered. Natalia walked through the fields, her feet steady, her posture serene. I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. She became what no inheritance could buy, a woman who survived disappointment without letting it define her. Late in the afternoon, a van pulled up to the little beachfront square. Teenagers, mothers, and women with visible and invisible scars got out, welcomed by Casa Albor, Juliana's project. She was waiting for them at the door, with the same calm that she had never had for herself before. Now, she was shelter. One particular afternoon, one of them, a girl of just 16, asked Juliana if it was true that she stole her sister's husband. Juliana didn't lie, nor did she justify herself. He just said, "The greatest betrayal wasn't that. It was allowing someone to pit us against each other, and that will never happen again." That same night, Juliana visited Hacienda Renaca. He found Natalia on the terrace, alone, looking at the sea. The two sat down. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. A warm breeze blew, carrying the scent of grapes and salt. There, where everything had collapsed, something new was born. It wasn't idealized love. It was not absolute forgiveness. It was respect rebuilt. And when Natalia, without warning, handed her sister a glass, the two toasted, not to victory nor to overcoming, but to the courage of having continued. In the distance, the city lights glowed like silent promises. And there, between sisters who were once rivals, an unbreakable pact was born, never again to allow love for someone else to destroy self-love, because in the end, the real traitor was not the forbidden lover, nor the impulsive sister. It was the lie that made everyone believe they needed to fight each other to be loved. This lie, finally, was buried, and upon their ashes, truth blossomed.